everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're so honored to have you all here today for our event, Turning Life Science Innovations into Startup Success. My name is Andrea Polito, and I'm the CEO and founder of SimplyFed, a company tackling infant nutrition. And I'm also a member of the faculty at Cornell University and the College of Engineering and Johnson College of Business. And I'm deeply honored to be here with our incredible panel, who you're all going to get the opportunity to meet in a couple minutes. But just some quick background information on today's webinar and panel. So the purpose of this webinar, which is hosted by the Johnson College of Business Bioentrepreneurship Initiative in the Cornell College of Engineering, is to really introduce you to some incredible leaders in the life science arena that have gone from scientists and continue to always be scientists to CEO. Much of our modern life science innovations are born from the efforts of talented research scientists. And the journey of these innovations that it takes them to get into the hands of the public is quite complex. Meanwhile, the researchers behind the innovations also undergo a significant journey themselves to adopt new skills and transition from a biologist to a business person and leader. I could not be more excited to be moderating this discussion today and introducing you to our incredible panel. But a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. In the keynote discussion, we encourage you to type your questions into the chat. If you have any questions for any of the panelists throughout the talk, please drop them into the chat box and we'll review them near the end, the last 10 or 15 minutes. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please note that in your question and we'll make sure to address it to them. Just so you know, you can find the chat icon in the upper right corner of the screen. If you're in full screen mode, you'll need to exit full screen mode in order to see the chat icon. We've gotten that question in the past. So we're going to spend a few minutes doing introductions. You're going to get to hear the background and about the companies of each of our panelists. And then we'll go into a moderated discussion for about 30 or 40 minutes. And then lastly, we'll end with some questions from all of you. So please make sure to put those questions in the chat as we go. Now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce each of our panelists. So we'll go one by one. I'll introduce our first panelist, and then they'll give some background on their company and themselves. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Abraham Heifetz, who's the CEO and founder of Atomwise. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your company.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk to all of you and appreciate the attention. So my name is Abraham Heifetz. I did my undergrad and my master's at Cornell, and then I went to work in computer science. I worked on what today, no joke, is referred to as good old-fashioned AI. So RoboCup was one of the projects that I worked on. And then I went to work for IBM Research in Boston doing, probably today we call it big data. We call it high-performance data processing. And I really liked, my coworkers and the work was technically interesting and I liked my boss. But being at a big company, I kind of felt that the impact I could have wasn't that big, right? Like, if we succeeded or we failed, IBM was going to do just fine. And so I wanted to be able to have more of an impact on destiny and be able to work on what I wanted to work on. So I got interested in medicine, specifically organic chemistry. I started taking some organic chemistry courses and thought that this was pretty cool. And so then I went back and did a PhD in computational biology at the University of Toronto. And out of there, I met my co-founder in grad school, and out of there we spun out Atomwise. And Atomwise, we were one of the pioneers in using modern machine learning techniques for drug design. And specifically, we're the first people to use convolutional neural networks to predict protein small molecule binding. You've used these convnets if you've ever talked to Siri or Alexa, if you've ever unlocked your iPhone by holding it up and it recognizes your face. So we were the first team to apply those, not to image recognition or speech recognition, but to molecular recognition. And so since inventing that, we've been doing a wide series of partnerships with big pharma companies like Bayer and Eli Lilly, with emerging biotechs like Hansoh, China's biggest biotech, A2I in Israel, BridgeBio in South Korea, hundreds of academic collaborations around the world, and work with NGOs like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative. And recently, we've really focused the company to work on our own internal drug discovery projects, and we're hiring.
Always got to give that last plug in for the hiring. Well, next up, excited to introduce Dr. Jacob Beecraft, CEO and co-founder of Strand Therapeutics. So over to you.
Thanks. And thanks for having me here. So by way of background, I also started my career as a scientist. I initially had looked at the field of gene therapy of delivering synthetic DNAs back in the late 2000s. What I was really passionate about was the idea that almost all non-infectious disease, so cancer, heart disease, rare diseases, cystic fibrosis, almost all of them have a genetic component, or really a genetic origin. And so the idea was that if you can deliver a synthetic gene, you could actually fix that problem. And though I started in synthetic DNA, when I actually did my PhD at MIT. When I came to MIT, I decided that I was going to focus mostly on this new emerging field at the time of synthetic biology, which kind of sought to, rather than design more complicated systems, kind of wanted to actually engineer the nucleic acids themselves. But at the same time that I joined Ron Weiss at MIT in the Synthetic Biology Center, what I also was exposed to through another member of the lab was this idea of messenger RNA therapeutics. Nowadays, we all know about mRNA therapeutics because a lot of us have it injected into our arms in the form of the COVID vaccines. But at the time, back in the early 2010s, we were just getting started. Moderna and BioNTech actually had just been co-founded. And at the Synthetic Biology Center, we were thinking, well, this platform is going to be revolutionary for vaccines, but what would it take to turn messenger RNA into a more rigorous therapeutic platform? How could we use messenger RNA to treat some of those diseases with the same genetic components, such as that my DNA work was focused on, now using messenger RNA instead, because there's a number of advantages in both scalability and deliverability that have allowed the messenger RNA vaccines to really take hold as well. So we set out working to build technology on top of messenger RNA, what we called the first messenger RNA synthetic biology programming language, which was to say that we built messenger RNAs that could be delivered into the body and actually understand where they were in the body, and then activate the messenger RNA drugs that were encoded in particular targets. And then at the same time, as I was finishing my PhD, I got a lot of exposure into the Boston biotech ecosystem and venture capital. And what that led to was a focus on how to actually translate academic work into commercial entities. And so in 2018, my co-founder and I, along with two professors at MIT, formed Strand Therapeutics, which is a messenger RNA therapeutics company focused on cancer, as well as a number of other rare diseases. And that has been growing over the past 3 to 4 years. Now we're a larger company, like Abraham had just said about his company. We've struck a number of deals with other pharmaceutical companies, as well as develop our own internal therapeutics pipeline focused mainly on cancer and some other individual rare disease applications. And also, like Abraham said, we are hiring.
I love it. I love it. It's a good commercial for attracting talent, which is one of our goals here always. Well, next up and last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Freya, founder and CEO of Selmatics.
Hey guys, great to be here today. Thank you. So I had the opportunity to move to New York City and start my PhD and complete my PhD at Weill Cornell. So Cornell, but in the city at the medical school campus. And I focused on biochemistry, cell and molecular biology. The early part of my PhD was focused on protein chemistry and X-ray crystallography. And then later I pivoted into mouse models of reproductive health and function in mammals. So broadly, I've been innovating in women's health for a little bit over 20 years. Again, in academia, starting off at Cornell in my PhD work, then went to the University of Cambridge in the UK, did my postdoctoral work in Cambridge, and then really launched my entrepreneurial journey from Cambridge. So when I was in the city, back in the early aughts, there weren't role models for me at the time that when I was at Weil or in the New York biotech scene generally, of people who were early in their careers as scientists, exiting and starting innovative companies. That model existed in Boston and in Silicon Valley and San Diego, but not so much in New York. What was interesting is when I did my postdoctoral work in Cambridge, I was introduced to people who were exiting their PhDs or their postdocs and really progressing their scientific careers and innovation in the private sector, through venture-backed startups. And so I was inspired. I also turned 30 the year I was inspired to found the company. And what was, I think, important for a women's health company is that tends to be the year when women pivot from focusing on trying not to get pregnant to worrying whether they can get pregnant. Seems to be this kind of magical nexus that happens at 30. And it certainly happened for me too. And this is before, this concept of femtech existed. And it was really the early days when not a lot of digital health or, any kind of innovative approaches were applied to women's health. So I saw an opportunity, having really I got to be on the front lines of precision medicine and women's health oncology when I was at Weill Cornell and Sloan Kettering. And I saw the transformational impact that genome sequencing was having on our ability to understand who was at risk for cancer, to really be able to subset cancers when people develop them, but also just the huge impact that those genomic insights had on the intervention, so the drugs that we could actually develop to target these cancers. And when I shifted from kind of a focus on oncology into women's health outside of oncology, what I saw was a huge gap in applying some of those groundbreaking technologies to women's health outside of it. And so one of the reasons for the gap is because there were funding disparities, but what that translated into was data disparities. So I co-founded Selmatics actually with my Cornell roommate, with Laura Bandak, Laura Towert at the time. So Laura and I founded Selmatics with this vision of really creating a personalized and precision medicine company uniquely focused on women's health. And kind of fast forward today, we are now having built and launched a digital health platform and also diagnostic, have now focused our efforts on therapeutics, and have, like Abraham and Jacob, had the opportunity. We collaborate with Bayer, Evotech, the Gates Foundation, but also have been prioritizing our internal pipeline. And our lead drug, which hopefully I'll get to tell you a little bit more about today, is a drug that we hope will help women be able to extend their ovarian function, which is another way of saying delaying menopause.
Wonderful. Well, as the audience can see here today, you all have incredible backgrounds as scientists and now as business leaders, and you're truly changing the game in each of your respective verticals. And so thanks so much for sharing your background and a quick overview of your company. And I hope to dive in a little bit more throughout the panel. But one thing I want to highlight and kick off with we'll first go to Dr. Heifetz back up to the top of the line is, as a former scientist myself, is when I was at the beginning of my career, I knew I wanted to do entrepreneurship, but it was hard to know where to go. And a bit of what Dr. Vine was saying as well is that there were no role models. And how did you know how to get started and raise your first round or what to do next with founding your ventures? And so I know each of you touched on this, but I'd love to go to Dr. Heifetz first. Can you expand a little bit more about the pathway that you took from seeing this pain point to actually starting your venture? What did that look like?
Sure. I had no idea. Like, let me be completely clear here. I had no idea. I was a grad student and University of Toronto, I think, had huge envy for some of the schools, that had been spinning out companies. And so they had launched a number of different mentorship programs. And I remember sitting in one, and it was somebody who was talking about, like, in one of these lectures, and it was somebody who was talking about, like, when you are 40 people, here are the HR regulations that all of a sudden kick in and that you're going to have to, handle. And I remember thinking, like, I have no idea how to incorporate a company. Like, I wish I had these problems to solve, right? Like, that would be such incredible. 40 people, are you kidding me? Like, that would be such incredible progress. And and I had no idea. No joke. Let me, at the risk of giving a long and meandering answer to your question, let me tell you like how I incorporated, which was I was doing like a pitch competition, and because I hadn't pitched before, I thought that would be a good way of getting feedback on what was working and what wasn't. So I built some slides, and we were going through this series, and actually we made it to the end, and we won best student team. And so because we were going to be winners, they said, okay, great, like there's a prize for some of this. They said, like, send us your incorporation number, like send us the documents about the company. And I was like, yes, of course, I will definitely get that to you. And then I sit there and I Google how to incorporate. And it turns out like you can do it. Anybody can be CEO with like 15 minutes, and I think it was a $200 registration fee. So it's actually not that difficult. And so, but that's why, like, on a Friday on April 4th, we incorporated. That was what the impetus actually was, and what it took was a Googling. I wish they had asked for it like a few days earlier, because then we could have been on April Fool's Day, like incorporated, April 1st, and that would have been better. But what can you do? So let me begin now a minute into my answer, by just telling everybody in the audience that, like, I give you permission. Nobody will ever give you more permission than that. And so this is as much permission as you get to have. And so go do it, right? If you want to do it, like, there you go. That's as much permission as you need. I think the way you go and do these, there's a lot of resources out there these days. You can find the paperwork on Y Combinator's website, and it is standard. Investors know it these days. There's a ton of commentary of VC blogs and other blogs about how to get companies kicked off. There's a lot of mentorship programs that these days actually don't have people who are talking about HR when you're 40 people, but talk about that early genesis of getting going, and licensing out IP and even a network to connect you with folks who have been there before, and know what you're going through. And so I think just leverage everything, and probably actually in many cases, if because scientists have gone this route of commercialization, either other professors have spun out companies, or either your advisor has spun out a company, or others in the community have. And so all of these, and people are willing to have conversations, and people are if you want to talk to me, I'm happy to talk to you about your particular company. So I think communities are generally sort of giving, but concretely, I think the training that happens in a PhD and postdoc is, how do you, with no budget, no authority, no resources, ask questions which are answerable questions, right? Like, that's what a PhD is. And that's really what a big part of running a company is you have some hypothesis that, the world needs some solution, that there exist customers, enough of them, who will pay enough to support the costs of building, making the product and changing the world. You think that in the manner the world needs changing, and so now you've got a set of hypotheses, and you go and de-risk those hypotheses as quickly as possible. I actually think the training from science directly translates into actually the running of the business. If you just phrase it as, here are the unknowns, or here are the things that must be true if this is going to work out, and then you just pick the most risky of that list, and you go figure out an experiment which will prove or disprove, and you iterate until you succeed, or you don't, and you go get a real job and do it again when you get the next idea.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the scientific method just lends itself so nicely to the same process that you go through with de-risking your assumptions with starting a venture. And And also thanks for sharing, the dirty secret of how your company really got founded. Often when you're on panels, everyone goes from 0 to, we had 100 employees, or, $50 million in funding. And sometimes we don't hear those initial stories of how one gets started. And Dr. Beecraft, anything to add to that, or any other stories that you can share about the pathway, that the real background of how you got started with your venture?
It's messy when you do it the first time. I think that's true for most things in life. And like, I think that maybe the most important thing to add onto what Abe said was, you need to talk about your vision relentlessly. Like, there's a lot, I meet a lot of younger people. I do similar things like that I know Abe also does to mentoring, especially PhD students who are spinning their stuff out. When I was first spinning out Strand, there actually weren't a lot of younger, like, PhD to CEO mentors or people at the time. There was only one friend of mine who was 2 years older that started a company. It was the only person I knew who had done it in Boston biotech. There were some examples in San Francisco, no one I knew. And so it was kind of hard to even put yourself in that, could that be done? There's a lot of people in Boston biotech, at least, that were saying that it shouldn't be done, that only, old white dudes can be biotech CEOs. And so as a future old white dude, I was like, well, I don't want to wait 30 years. So I would like to try to start this now. And I think the biggest thing was just to talk about it relentlessly. When I talk to younger founders now, when I talk to PhD students, sometimes they're very cautious. And I think that's always safe. But you have to remember that, like, if your idea is so obvious and easy to execute on that by simply mentioning your vision that someone else will swoop in and steal it from you and then be able to outcompete you, then they'll probably outcompete you eventually anyway. And so when you're young, and when you're, regardless of age, actually, when you just don't know what you're doing, you have to talk about that vision, talk about your goals, talk about your ambitions, just unbelievably relentlessly to every single person that will talk to you. I don't know how many coffees I bought people just to get them to sit with me for 30 minutes or 60 minutes, talk to them about what I wanted to build, talk to them about why we wanted to build it, kiss an incredible amount of frogs until finally landing on, it took me over a year to raise our first round of capital. And that was through a whole number of things that were very not fun, things that ruined my Christmas one year. And so it's a learning process. But the more people you can talk to, and people reach out to me a lot, and I try to at least pay that forward and at least take calls with young entrepreneurs for at least 30 minutes to sort of say basically, which is always saying the same thing, which is like, tell your vision, talk to as many people as possible, talk to as many experienced folks as possible, understand what sort of role models that you need, right? Someone who is is someone who climbed a corporate ladder to an executive level and is now an executive in biotech is probably not going to have the right advice for you if you are a 29-year-old PhD student trying to spin your research out. They're just not going to understand it because, again, like, you're going to get people who are like, well, when you're over 40, here are the HR compliance issues that you run into, when you're really like, how do I get a meeting with a VC and what do I even talk to them about, right? And that's a skill set that that you'll only get from people who have done it. So just talk to literally as many people as possible and talk about your dreams relentlessly.
Yeah, thanks for that. And, I found that those near peer mentors, the person that's one step ahead of you, I've gotten the most honest but helpful advice with, because they just were in your shoes. And Dr. Abraham, on that note, is how did you first get started, and what resources were truly beneficial to you when you were getting your company off the ground?
I think there's going to be a lot of parallels to what you've heard already. So I came from an academic family. I hadn't taken a single business class at any stage of my education. And so I think I suffered a lot from the imposter syndrome, of, how am I going to get this off the ground? But I think what Abraham said really resonated, which is what I realized as I started to actually move through it, was that my training and my PhD and my postdoc was exactly what I needed. So to his point, you have no resources, you have a vision, you have to get the resources together to progress that vision. And ultimately you have to exit, right? You have to publish, you have to graduate, you have to move on. And so there's a timeline component as well. And that's one of the things that I have really tried to encourage people who are, I think, the target for this panel, which is, you know, to Abraham's point, you have permission. If you are in an advanced degree program, especially if you're doing a science PhD, you know, all that training you have is exactly the DNA that you need to go do it. You could probably avoid some of the awkward moments, like, you know, what he had or what I had. I remember somebody asked me for my P&L, and I wrote to an advisor and said, I need a P, N as in Nancy, L. What is that? And, you know, and he said, I think you mean a P and L. And so then I realized I needed to go audit a finance class. So I got a professor at Columbia Business School to agree to let me audit his, you know, year one finance class. And I learned all these amazing new terms. But again, you have the DNA. If you have gone through a rigorous advanced degree program, you can audit a finance class and get all of the technical terms that you need to be able to sound a lot more educated, to Jacob's point, when you actually sit down with a VC. I mean, I got laughed out of my first 10 VC conversations because they asked me, what's your business model? And I said, well, if you can help me understand what you mean by business model, then I can tell you what my business model is, you know? So what I realized very early on was, yes, I think the passion and relentlessly sharing your passion, your vision will help. But you do actually need to bring some technical expertise in how to talk, you know, to investors in an educated way. And I had the benefit of going through it was a very short boot camp. It was like a 2-week boot camp that was funded by the state of New York. It was run out of SUNY Stony Brook. And I actually, Jacob got into some of his, I'll, you know, just say, I was uncompensated and had no health insurance for 18 months in New York City. I lived on couches. I had a keychain that had like 20 keys on it. And I would text people and just say, can I crash on your couch tonight? Or can I crash on your couch? And so that's how I lived for, you know, a year and a half. My parents, who are immigrants, were distraught. You know, they launched me into an amazing, PhD at top institution, you know, Cambridge. And then now I'm living on couches in New York City with no job, you know, and so that part I think was really hard. But what was nice about the boot camp was it was specifically for academics who are transitioning into the business world, and they paired you with students who were in the MBA program, et cetera, who helped you figure out what's my business model, what's my addressable market, gave you the terminology. And then the final output at the end of that 2 weeks was a pitch. And they lined you up in front of a bunch of VCs. And it was in that pitch that I met our lead investor, who's now invested north of $80 million, you know, just that one investor over the years. So don't underestimate those accelerator programs, those incubator programs. You know, there's so many more of them. Like that was the one program in New York City. And it wasn't even in New York City. I had to go out to Long Island. And I actually stayed in the guest house of the guy who was organizing it in Long Island because I couldn't afford a hotel room. You know what I mean? So it was like that hard. But now there are so many programs, and I know Cornell has really been doubling down on providing that support for their graduates. So so maybe the headlines are you have everything you need except for some of the technical stuff, and you can go get that through, you know, courses, going online. Another resource is the NVCA website. I think is good. One of the things that there's so much waste in having every single startup paper unique documents for, you know, financing rounds and CDAs and things like that. And the NVCA has invested in really trying to standardize documentation. So as an entrepreneur, you're not getting cheated, you know, and you know what the basics are. So the resources are out there, you know, bravely go get them. But don't try to go it alone. I mean, you know, don't reinvent the wheel on this stuff. I think it just sounds a lot like what you've already heard.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And you know, the role of these accelerators in these programs, I know I did 3 with my first company because it just was a way to short circuit information. And also thanks for sharing the story about the P&L. My version of that is convertible note. You know, I always have a piece of paper next to me and I wrote down convertible note, like how does a note transform and convert? And I just had someone explain it. So we all have our version of that story. And so let's go back to Abraham, and you alluded to forming teams. So how did you decide who did you decide to add to your team? So now that we've gotten through the first part of each of your journeys, how did you decide to add to your team? And now that you're at scale beyond your personal networks, how did you identify and decide who to hire?
I mean, by putting "we're hiring" at the end of every time I give an introduction, right? Like that's the hack. I'll share like P&L, right? Or like if you tell me what you're asking when you say what's your business model, I think I still don't know what go-to-market means. Like I still have trouble because people throw around these things, and I don't know what's being asked. Anyway. It's fine. They're just some things that you need to memorize, I guess. I don't know. Teams. Okay, so practically and pragmatically, if people are starting out, the first people you meet, like the first people that you're adding are always going to be personal network, right? Because at the beginning, to Jacob's point, right, like you're